In a small provincial town, there lived a simple girl named Paula. From a young age, she endured many hardships, more than enough for several lifetimes, yet she faced them all alone. When Paula was just a few months old, her father abandoned her and her mother, Frances, in search of a better life. Paula barely remembered him, and Frances never spoke of him. Left to raise her daughter alone, Frances struggled greatly. Without a proper profession, she worked as a cleaner in a store, where her salary was meager. However, the store manager often helped her, sometimes by providing groceries or a small holiday bonus. Frances had distant relatives living on the outskirts of town, but they had no contact with her. They only cared about their own problems and found it unpleasant to associate with a simple cleaner. At night, Frances often cried and cursed her fate, but each morning she would head to the store to clean the floors before it opened. She had no choice but to bring little Paula in a stroller, leaving her in the back room. Despite Frances's efforts, their situation remained dire. Their diet was poor, causing Paula to be small for her age and often ill. When Paula turned 6, she began preparing for school like other children, but her mother couldn't afford a uniform. Frances dressed her daughter in the best dress she had, which she had altered from her own suit. Paula, holding a modest bouquet of flowers, proudly looked at her future classmates. She struggled through elementary school, receiving poor grades, but the teachers promoted her to middle school, recognizing that her academic difficulties were due to a lack of resources. However, Paula had beautiful handwriting, and the teachers often used her work as an example for other students. 2 months before graduation, Frances caught a severe cold. Paula was deeply worried and cried by her mother's bedside, unable to help. Neighbors called an ambulance and Frances was taken to the city hospital, where she was constantly monitored by medical staff. Each morning, Paula would come to the store to mop the floors before rushing off to school. The pale, malnourished girl struggled with a half-filled bucket of water. But the floors always gleamed. The store manager didn't mind the substitution as long as the store was clean. Sometimes, Paula cleaned after the store closed so she could sleep a bit longer in the morning before school. She visited her mother almost every day, though at first she wasn't allowed in because Frances was in critical condition. Frances's health briefly improved but then declined again. The doctors couldn't fully cure her illness, likely exacerbated by years of working in drafty conditions and poor nutrition. 1 week later, her condition suddenly worsened, and 2 days later, unexpected complications arose. In the middle of the day, Frances suddenly passed away. Paula was informed of her mother's death by the doctors. Upon hearing the news, she fainted and had to be revived by the medical staff. She wept uncontrollably and had her first severe panic attack, prompting the attending doctor to consider hospitalizing her. At home, Paula regained some composure, but seeing her mother's empty bed, she broke down again, sometimes crying out in despair, which deeply worried her neighbors. Frances was buried with only Paula and 2 of her neighbors in attendance at the cemetery. 2 workers from the store brought a wreath from the staff and handed Paula a sealed envelope from the director, which contained a sum of money. Paula passed her final exams but did not pursue college. Instead, she immediately began looking for work. She was fortunate to find a cleaning job at an office in a new building in the city center. The young staff readily accepted her because the previous applicants had been older women experienced in cleaning but deemed unsuitable due to their age. The general director believed that a young cleaner would fit better with the youthful team, and he was also taken by Paula's appearance. Initially, the office staff laughed at the young cleaner, but Paula ignored the teasing, and the jokes soon stopped. She valued her job greatly and performed her duties meticulously. The office floors always shone, regardless of the weather. Paula lived in a modest house inherited from her mother. 6 months after her mother's death, she officially inherited the house and transferred all the documents to her name. Her salary was paid regularly, so she never had debts. She lived modestly and alone. Paula's personal life was uneventful. After reaching adulthood, she spent most of her time at work and had no close friends. Young men her age were looking for fleeting adventures rather than serious relationships, which did not appeal to Paula. Like all girls, she dreamed of true love and romantic relationships, where her partner would kiss her tenderly instead of breathing cheap alcohol in her face. Years passed and Paula's personal life remained unchanged. However, when she turned 20, she had a brief relationship with a young man named Alan, who was drawn to the modest girl he met at a disco. They dated for a few weeks, and Alan even hinted at marriage. But after visiting Paula's home and realizing her poverty, he decided not to pursue the relationship further and quietly disappeared from her life. Paula was deeply hurt by Alan's departure. Though she hadn't been thinking about marriage yet, it pained her to tears that she trusted him, only for him to act so cruelly. In the evenings she would stay up late reading books, often imagining herself in the place of the heroines in romance novels. Her house had a small library, which fueled her love for reading. In the office, Paula didn't form any close friendships, though the young director hinted that he wanted to see her outside of work without the other employees knowing. Paula was now wary of such meetings, as her belief in the possibility of genuine friendship between men and women had weakened. She understood that life wasn't like the beautiful movies shown in local theaters, and she distrusted people, as they rarely were kind to each other. This was evident in the office dynamics, where everyone aimed for the senior manager position and was often willing to resort to unkind actions to secure it. As a cleaner, Paula was often unnoticed but was aware of many things happening in the office. People would discuss their issues or intricate schemes in her presence, not considering her as someone who could comprehend or reveal their secrets. Paula knew a lot but never shared anything with anyone. She was an inadvertent keeper of some confidential information. She didn't expect any major changes in her life, but fate had a significant test in store for her. One winter evening, as she was returning from work, she saw an elderly man in a small snow-covered park. Despite the approaching blizzard, he sat on a bench, seemingly lost in thought or perhaps dozing, oblivious to the snowfall and strong gusts of wind. The man held a beautiful leather briefcase, which clearly did not belong to him, as such an item was typically owned by wealthy businessmen or company executives. At first, Paula hesitated to intervene in a stranger's life, but it was clear that the lonely and seemingly homeless man needed help. "If I walk by and he freezes to death, how will I live with that?" Paula whispered to herself. "No, I can't let him freeze." "Good evening," she addressed the stranger. "Why are you sitting out in the cold? A blizzard is coming soon. Do you have nowhere to go?" "I'm already home." "My home is the street." "Wait, let me take you to my place. I live nearby. There's a place to warm up. You won't inconvenience me, and I can give you hot tea with raspberry jam to keep you from getting sick." "Why do you care about a homeless old man? You're young and pretty. Your husband must be waiting for you at home." "I'm not married, and I live alone, so no one is waiting for me. My house has 2 rooms, and I can offer you one for temporary shelter. Please don't refuse. I won't leave you out here. The blizzard is starting, and the wind is getting stronger. You could freeze. My home is warm." "And you'll warm up quickly," Paula said with concern. The elderly stranger hesitated. On one hand, he was already quite cold, but the idea of going home with an unknown young woman made him wary. He had long since lost faith in the selfless kindness of others. However, the temptation to be warm and have some hot tea was strong. After a brief moment of hesitation, he agreed. As he took off his coat in the hallway, Paula put a kettle on the stove to make fresh tea and searched the fridge for jam. She always made sure to have good tea. With every paycheck in advance, she bought a packet of real tea and stored it in a special tin box. The unexpected guest went to the bathroom and thoroughly washed his hands. It was clear that he had once been a cultured person, used to taking care of himself, and had become a drifter due to circumstances beyond his control. In the light, Paula could see him better. He appeared to be about 60, slightly hunched over. They introduced themselves, and Paula learned his name was Tony. Tony had once been a certified specialist working at a factory. He lived in an apartment and had a family, but all that was in the past. Tony grew up in an orphanage, standing out among the other children with his quiet nature and particular cleanliness. While others raided private gardens, Tony never joined in. Life in the orphanage was tough. One had to survive as the other. Children, sensing weakness, would bully, and the caregivers offered little help. Tony tried to find out from the adults who his parents were and how he ended up in the orphanage, but neither the teachers nor the director ever told him anything. Young Tony spent hours in the orphanage library, reading books which helped him excel in school. However, the constant hunger always haunted him, and at night he dreamed of tables filled with delicious desserts. After finishing school and coming of age, Tony, like other orphanage graduates, received a one-room apartment and enrolled in university. He graduated 5 years later with excellent grades. The young engineer was hired at a design bureau at a factory that produced equipment for the country's army. Soon, Tony met a girl working in accounting, and they dated for a year before deciding to marry. After the wedding, Tony was advised to turn in his one-room apartment to a special fund for factory workers, and in exchange, he received a two-room apartment in a newly built house. His wife, Valerie, couldn't have children due to health issues. Despite undergoing several full examinations at various clinics, the couple decided to adopt a girl from an orphanage. Tony agreed to this mainly because he feared for his wife's mental health, as she often had hysterical fits at the sight of other people's children. Unfortunately, Valerie didn't enjoy her role as a mother for long. When Jacqueline turned 5, Valerie passed away suddenly. In just 2 weeks, she succumbed to a severe illness that, without showing any symptoms, gradually drained the young woman of her life force. After Valerie's funeral, Tony often visited her grave at the local cemetery, sharing how difficult his life had become without her. It was difficult for Tony to raise a child alone. After visiting his wife's grave, he would wipe away his tears and rush to work, knowing he needed to earn money. Despite the challenges, Tony couldn't bring himself to put Jacqueline in an orphanage, having grown up in one himself. He struggled with tasks like braiding her hair and had no idea how to care for a young girl. Fortunately, his neighbor provided some essential tips on raising a child. The factory management supported Tony, allowing him to work extra hours to provide for his adopted daughter. Luckily, there was a daycare near their home where Tony could drop off little Jacqueline early in the morning and pick her up late in the evening. Soon Jacqueline started school, and Tony had to enroll her in an after-school program to avoid leaving her home alone. As she grew up, Jacqueline became quite unruly. Tony had been warned about her bad heredity back in the orphanage, but his wife had insisted on adopting her, and he couldn't refuse. Teachers often complained to Tony about Jacqueline's disruptive behavior in class and her tantrums in the after-school program. She didn't take her father's serious talks to heart, and Tony refrained from physical punishment. During his occasional visits to his wife's grave, Tony lamented his struggles with raising Jacqueline, but over the years he had grown used to her and even developed a kind of love for her. By the time Jacqueline reached high school, she was dreaming of a luxurious life and demanded expensive clothes to keep up with her classmates. Tony couldn't afford everything she wanted, leading to a complete breakdown in their relationship. Jacqueline decided that after finishing high school, she would marry a rich man, not a mechanic or an engineer from the old factory. At 17, Jacqueline was beautiful, with a great figure that attracted many admiring glances from men. She had perfected a walk that swayed her hips, deliberately enticing them. Jacqueline's dreams soon came true. At a disco, she met a stylishly dressed young man named Joshua, who quickly won over the inexperienced girl. Within a month, he met Tony. Initially, Joshua seemed like a good match, but while Tony was skilled with technical matters, he wasn't good at reading people. In a private conversation, Joshua revealed that he was willing to marry Jacqueline, but they had nowhere to live. He suggested that if Tony sold his apartment and bought a one-bedroom apartment for himself and Jacqueline in different neighborhoods, it would solve their housing problem. Tony took a long time to make a decision, but the pressure from his future son-in-law and his adopted daughter was so intense that he eventually gave in to their arguments. He later deeply regretted this decision, but it was too late. The deal to sell the apartment went through, but Tony never saw the money or the one-bedroom apartment. It turned out that Joshua and Jacqueline had sold the apartment, taken the money, and disappeared from the city, leaving Tony homeless. Upon learning this, the old engineer nearly had a heart attack. How was he supposed to live now, and more importantly, where? He had to ask the factory management for a room in the dormitory, which they granted him. Previously, Tony had been indifferent to alcohol, drinking only a little during holidays with good company. But now, he began to mark the end of the work week with drinks every Friday. Soon, his colleagues saw him in the bar every evening, leaving late at night in a rather unsteady manner. 6 months later, his situation continued to deteriorate. Tony was eventually fired due to repeated absences and drinking on the job. Naturally, this also meant he had to leave the dormitory. Tony had been living on the streets for over 10 years. In the early years, he became quite close with a local janitor who sometimes let him sleep in the tool room, but the janitor eventually left town, and Tony lost his only friend. He stopped drinking because he could barely afford it. Sometimes he ate at a church that organized free meals for the needy and homeless. One day, Tony found a brand new backpack under some trash at the dump. Inside, he discovered documents and a substantial amount of money. The homeless man took the find and later, in an abandoned building where he had set up a temporary shelter, he examined the documents. They likely belonged to a local businessman who owned a company. The old engineer decided to return the items to their owner but didn't know how to find him in the city. Upon learning this, the old engineer nearly had a heart attack. How was he supposed to live now, and more importantly, where? He had to ask the factory management for a room in the dormitory, which they granted him. Previously, Tony had been indifferent to alcohol, drinking only a little during holidays with good company. But now, he began to mark the end of the work week with drinks every Friday. Soon, his colleagues saw him in the bar every evening, leaving late at night in a rather unsteady manner. "Please take me to your boss tomorrow morning," Tony said. "I want to return his briefcase. The monetary reward would be very useful since I'm completely out of funds and have no way to earn any." Paula listened carefully to the homeless man's story and then asked to see the documents. It turned out the briefcase belonged to the general director of the company where she worked as a cleaner. Many of the documents bore his name and initials in small print at the bottom, next to spaces for signatures and seals. Paula had recently overheard two employees discussing a sensational piece of news during lunch. The general director's briefcase had been stolen, containing important documents for a major deal. Tom, the director, was so upset that he announced a large reward for anyone who found it. He had invested a lot in this project, and competitors would be thrilled to get their hands on the documents to close the deal themselves. The elderly homeless man was moved to tears by her words and assured Paula he would repay her kindness in the future, but she insisted she needed nothing in return. The storm lasted until almost noon on Monday. So much snow had fallen that the city's transportation system came to a standstill, and even the best drivers didn't dare take their cars out of the garages. Almost all the men in the small town went out to help the municipal services clear the streets and sidewalks because the janitors couldn't manage on their own. Paula spent 3 hours clearing the small yard and making a path to the street. She forbade Tony from going outside because he had been coughing heavily at night and had a high fever. "The forecast says the blizzard will last all weekend," Paula replied. "We've been told the office will be closed until Monday, so you won't be able to go anywhere. You'll stay with me. Don't worry, I won't charge you for staying here, let's just consider it a visit. When the weather improves, I'll take you to the office. There's no need for you to be out in the cold. Stay inside where it's warm. We probably won't be going to work today, we'll postpone everything until tomorrow. The boss called and told everyone to stay home, but we need to be in the office by 8 on Tuesday, no excuses." The meeting between the former homeless man and the company director took place in the CEO's office. None of the employees knew what they discussed for an hour. Soon after, Tom called in the head of HR and the chief accountant. Paula was delighted to learn that Tony was now going to work as a security guard, rewarded for his honesty. Tony hadn't spent any of the money he had found, and the boss rewarded him with a month's salary as a guard. The director's personal driver, Samuel, took the new security guard to the company's premises, where he would begin his new life. The company decided to take Tony to a barber shop and then to the nearest store, where they bought him a suit, a white shirt, and sturdy shoes as his uniform. Tony was transformed. The suit highlighted his figure, and the new haircut and clean-shaven face made him look younger. He now greeted employees with a smile every morning and was the last to leave, handing over the premises to the night guard. Tony lived with Paula, referring to himself as her grandfather. With his first paycheck, he bought a large shortbread cake from the bakery and 2 packs of premium tea. "Why did you buy this particular cake? Don't you like sponge cake?" Paula asked. "The thing is, sponge cakes are often soaked in brandy, and I'm now living a sober life. Plus, my late wife used to bake these shortbread cakes masterfully for family celebrations," Tony explained. Tony wanted to contribute to the rent, but Paula refused. So the former homeless man made a condition: he would either buy groceries or give Paula money for them. "Otherwise, I'll move to the dormitory," he said, adding that Tom had mentioned it would be no problem to arrange a separate room for him there. Living with Tony was easy for Paula, and she found it less lonely. There was always someone to talk to, and Tony, whom she now called Grandpa, had many life stories to share and could give wise advice. By nature, Tony was sociable. While working as a guard, he met and became quite close friends with a young doctor who often visited their boss. His new friend, Brian, had once been a successful surgeon with great ambitions, performing successful operations and held in high regard by the city hospital administration. But family circumstances forced him to leave and work in a city clinic, where he now listened to the complaints of pensioners. Brian had previously lived with his parents in a suburban cottage. One day, they took out a large loan using the house as collateral but couldn't repay it. The bank repossessed the cottage, forcing Brian to move into a modest house inherited from his late grandmother. He had to arrange for his parents to undergo compulsory treatment for alcoholism and later move them to a nursing home where they received round-the-clock care. Both pensions went towards paying for their treatment and accommodation. Most of Brian's earnings were spent on supporting his parents, as their pensions were minimal. As a security guard, Tony often overheard conversations among employees. One day he happened to overhear a discussion between the CEO, Tom, and a local fortune teller who had been trying to catch Tom at the office entrance for days, as she hadn't been issued a pass. "I see you have serious health problems, and you are in mortal danger if you don't have surgery soon. I know a good surgeon who can resolve this issue for a modest fee. There's no need to worry, I have an old friend who can handle this easily, and I ask you not to bother me again. Tony. Please ensure this woman never enters the office. If she appears again, call the police immediately," Tom instructed. Tom, feeling somewhat unsettled by the fortune teller's words, decided to verify her claims. He had been feeling some deterioration in his health recently. By the end of the day, he would be extremely fatigued. So he turned to his longtime friend Brian to check his health. Brian conducted a thorough examination but found no pathologies requiring urgent surgery. "You need to take some vitamins and certain stimulating medications, perhaps get a few IV drips to cleanse your blood, but I wouldn't advise surgery," Brian told Tom. The businessman followed his friend's recommendations, and after 3 weeks he felt much better. An investigation revealed that the fortune teller had been hired by competitors aiming to sideline Tom temporarily, so they could snatch a lucrative contract for building a new entertainment complex in the city's Central Park. Law enforcement took an interest in the fraud, and as a token of gratitude, Tom gave Brian some money to build a clinic, fulfilling Brian's lifelong dream. Years passed, and Tony continued living with Paula. He was about to retire when he suddenly lost consciousness at his post. Paramedics rushed him to the city hospital, where he was admitted to the ICU. Unfortunately, Tony unexpectedly fell into a coma, and outsiders were not allowed to visit critical patients. Paula, devastated, would stop by the hospital on her way home, but no matter how much she pleaded, she couldn't see Tony. The ICU had strict visitation rules. A week later, Paula scheduled a meeting with the CEO and requested time off to care for Tony. They don't allow visitors in the ICU, but they urgently need orderlies for patient care. "I want to work there to personally look after my grandfather," she explained. "I understand your dedication, and I'm generally okay with it, but the office will get dirty in your absence since we have no other maintenance staff," the CEO replied. "I can do the cleaning after all the employees leave," Paula suggested. "Then why do you need time off? You can work on a different schedule, and I'll notify building security. Tony is a valuable employee, you know. He was once a highly skilled engineer before he ended up on the street. I was thinking of making him a technical consultant. But then he suddenly fell ill. I'm sure he will recover. It's important to be there for him. Some doctors say that patients in a coma can still hear and feel, so I want to be close to him," the CEO responded. While working at the city hospital, Paula met a fairly attractive orderly named Benjamin, who was raising a young son alone because his wife had left them and moved out of town. Benjamin's son, Bobby, was born with a congenital defect, a curvature of his left arm that required surgery, but they couldn't afford it. Benjamin was doing his best but couldn't raise the necessary funds. Gradually, Paula and Benjamin developed a friendly relationship, but they couldn't meet outside of work. Benjamin's son needed constant attention, and Paula rushed to the office after her hospital shifts to tidy up. Tony remained unconscious, but doctors assured her that significant improvements were expected soon, provided they could obtain the scarce and expensive medications he needed, which Paula couldn't afford. She could have asked Tom for help, but because of his apparent interest in her, she hesitated. Recently, the director had asked her out several times, but she always found a reason to decline. Honestly, she was attracted to the focused young executive, but she was cautious about hoping for anything serious, even though he had clearly hinted at his serious intentions.